16 plus, Tom and Jerry Spinoff 3. Introduction. Hello. This is another spin-off of the Tom and Jerry show I made. This is not related to the first two spin-offs. This is not a continuation. This is completely separate from the first two I made. This is very violent and disturbing in some scenes. Viewer discretion is advised. I made this for entertainment purposes only. This is very funny. This is probably my most violent story ever. No humans or animals were harmed in the making of this. This is only for people over 16 years old due to the graphic nature of this warning. This is only for people over 16 years of age. This is very violent with tons of fighting and weapons. This is very violent. Viewer discretion is advised. This is made for enjoyment and entertainment purposes only. That is all I have to say. Enjoy the story. Plot. It is a balmy day in Utica, New York. On a random street, Thomas is getting off his school bus. Thomas walks into his owner's house. A few seconds later, Thomas's owner grandma gives Thomas the death stare. Then Thomas flips off grandma. Grandma reacts to this by picking up Thomas. Grandma screams at Thomas about his homework. Apparently Thomas hasn't been doing his homework for an entire week. Grandma screeches like a howler monkey. Thomas apologizes but grandma ignores his fake pleading. Thomas screams like a girl as he is being punched in the downstairs area. Grandma screeches like a howler monkey as she throws Thomas into the kitchen. Thomas lands on the floor and he lets out a massive roar of pain. Grandma runs into the kitchen. Grandma picks up Thomas. She then forces Thomas to wash the dishes. Thomas sighs as he begins washing the dishes. A few seconds later, Thomas throws a dish at Grandma. Grandma gives Thomas the mega death stare. A few seconds later, smoke starts leaking out of Grandma's ears. Grandma begins to get red. Thomas knows he is dead meat. A few minutes later, Grandma's entire body is bright red. Steam is shooting out of her ears. Thomas sneaks away as Grandma finally explodes. Grandma screams in anger as she begins stomping towards Thomas. Thomas grabs a 5F-4.43 device. Thomas blasts Grandma. Grandma brushes it off. A second later, she begins stomping even harder. Soon the house starts shaking with every step Grandma takes. Thomas runs away. He gets into Grandma's tank. A few seconds later, Grandma walks through the front door while it is closed. Thomas screams and drives off at 4 miles per hour. 1 minute later, Grandma gets onto the tank. She opens the top hatch. Thomas gets out via an emergency escape. A few seconds later, Grandma starts driving the tank. Grandma aims the barrel of the tank at Thomas. Thomas runs to get his bike. A few minutes later, Thomas arrives at a train station. Thomas sees Grandma's tank speeding to the train station. Thomas gets onto his bike and he drives onto the train bridge right next to the station. Thomas gets off the bridge as the tank arrives. A few seconds later, the bridge explodes. Thomas starts running down the train tracks away from the station. Grandma punches herself in anger. 1 second later, the bridge collapses and the debris falls onto a 6-lane highway. Grandma drives her tank onto the train tracks. Grandma soon drives after Thomas. A few seconds later, Grandma begins blowing up the track. Thomas sees the tank is right next to him. Thomas stays in his bush to hide. Grandma gets out of the tank. She looks around. A few seconds later, the tank resumes driving down the track. Thomas sneaks back to the house. A few minutes later, Thomas sees the former bridge. He looks down and sees over 40 emergency vehicles. Thomas shouts that Grandma did it. He also explains everything that happened. A few seconds later, Thomas sees a fully loaded coal train approaching. Thomas ducks for cover as the train crashes onto the 6-lane highway. Thomas runs for his life as Grandma's tank arrives at the massive crash scene. Thomas jumps onto the highway and speeds off into the forest. Grandma takes her tank into the forest. Thomas runs out of the forest and runs home. 20 minutes later, Thomas arrives home. Thomas crashes onto the living room couch as a tank arrives at the house. A few seconds later, Thomas runs for his life. A minute later, he hijacks a stranger's car. Thomas drives off as Grandma's tank starts driving. Grandma begins blowing up random houses because she is enraged. A few minutes later, Grandma exits her tank. Grandma takes a look at the stolen car. Thomas takes this time to steal Grandma's tank. He drives off onto a rocky road. A few seconds later, Grandma begins chasing Thomas. A few minutes later, Thomas starts driving up a mountain. A few miles away, Grandma is running after Thomas. 10 minutes later, Grandma's tank turns around. Soon Grandma starts running away. 5 minutes later, Grandma gets into her tank. Thomas screams for his life. A few seconds later, Thomas hijacks a taxi. He drives off at 100 miles per hour. Soon Grandma's tank goes into maximum overdrive. Grandma drives off at 120 miles per hour. 10 minutes later, Thomas exits the taxi. Grandma then blows it up. Thomas runs back home. 10 minutes later, Thomas hijacks a semi-truck. He drives home as Grandma's tank begins blowing up a random highway. 30 seconds later, Grandma blows up a police station because she hates Thomas. Soon 30 police cars begin chasing the tank. Grandma blows up a bridge so the police cannot chase her. The debris falls on a train car full of explosives. 1 second later, the explosives go off and a massive explosion blows up a massive chunk of land. Grandma drives off. 30 minutes later, Thomas drives the semi-truck into the backyard pool. Thomas gets out as a flood of water gushes him away. He gets up and goes inside. 5 minutes later, Thomas screams as a tank pulls into the driveway. Thomas gets into the semi-truck and drives off. Grandma reverses out of the driveway and blows up the trailer of the semi-truck. Thomas gets out and runs away. Grandma begins driving the tank. Grandma screams like a god and shoots the road. 10 seconds later Thomas steals a jetpack. He flies away. 10 minutes later he lands at his school. 13 seconds later Grandma's tank arrives at the parking lot of Thomas's high school. Thomas hides in a bush as the school explodes. 10 seconds later Grandma's tank blows up the playground. Thomas sneaks to the field behind the school. Grandma drives off to home. 10 minutes later Thomas and Grandma arrive home. Grandma gets out of her tank and enters the house. Thomas screams as Grandma takes out a quadruple-barrel rocket launcher. 10 seconds later Thomas runs as Grandma blows up her basement. Thomas runs into the kitchen and does some chores to please Grandma. Grandma knows what he is up to. Thomas starts crying as Grandma picks up the fridge. A few seconds later Grandma throws the fridge at Thomas. Thomas ducks as the fridge crashes into the wall. A few seconds later an explosion occurs. Thomas runs outside and hijacks Grandma's helicopter. Grandma gets into her tank. She blows the helicopter up. Thomas takes out a rocket launcher and blows up the tank. Grandma flies out. 20 seconds later Grandma starts chasing Thomas with her Kitty Whipper 9000. A few minutes later Grandma starts whipping Thomas with the Kitty Whipper 9000. Thomas gets out and runs away. Grandma roars like a monkey as she is chasing Thomas down a freeway. A few minutes later Thomas runs into a police station. A few seconds later Grandma picks up Thomas. 1 second later Thomas is beaten into the shape of a pretzel. A few seconds later Thomas runs away to the train station. A few minutes later Thomas arrives at the scene of the broken bridge and crashed coal train. Thomas sees the entire mess is cleaned up and the bridge is being rebuilt. A few seconds later Thomas sees Grandma running towards the station. Thomas sees a handcar. 1 second later Thomas gets onto the handcar and begins traveling away from the station. 2 minutes later Grandma gets onto the track. She begins storming towards Thomas. 3 miles away Thomas hears a faint scream that is slowly getting louder. 3 minutes later Thomas hears the scream clearly. Thomas gets off the handcar and runs down a staircase at another train station. Thomas gets onto a bus that will drive him to Penn Station. A few seconds later the bus drives off. A few minutes later Thomas gets off the bus. A second later the bus explodes. Thomas sees Grandma has a rocket launcher. A few seconds later Thomas gets into a taxi. A second later the taxi speeds off. 1 nanosecond later Thomas and the driver get out as the cab explodes. A few seconds later Thomas hijacks a car and drives off. Grandma puts on a jetpack. She starts flying. 10 seconds later Grandma starts blowing up random houses with her rocket launcher. Grandma screams when her rocket launcher runs out of rockets. A few minutes later Thomas gets out of the stolen car. He then runs into an airport. 10 minutes later Thomas hijacks a plane. He gets out when he sees Grandma. Thomas runs for his life as Grandma takes out a grenade launcher. Grandma starts blowing up the airport. 10 seconds later Thomas gets onto a train. Soon Thomas escapes yet again. 30 seconds later the engine of the train explodes. Grandma lands on a car and gets into it. She finds Thomas hiding in a suitcase. Grandma takes the suitcase and walks off the train. A few seconds later Thomas escapes the suitcase and runs off. Soon Grandma gets into another tank. Grandma screams at Thomas for 1 week of missing homework. Thomas runs even faster as a tank is chasing him. A few seconds later Thomas sees the tank is about to blow up a historical art museum. Thomas runs inside and manages to evacuate everyone. After that the museum explodes. Grandma then drives off blowing up random buildings because she hates Thomas. A few seconds later Grandma takes out a grenade. She pulls the pin. Grandma throws the grenade at a library. A few seconds later a library explodes. Thomas screams and runs back home. 20 minutes later Thomas sees the house explode. Thomas gets into Grandma's Lamborghini and speeds off to Penn Station. 20 minutes later Thomas arrives at Penn Station. Thomas runs inside and gets an Amtrak ticket. 20 minutes later Thomas gets onto a train that will take him to Boston. 3 hours later Thomas gets off the train. Thomas runs out of the station and finds a hotel. 30 minutes later Thomas crashes onto a bed. He falls asleep. 10 minutes later Thomas hears a mysterious knocking. Thomas wakes up and sees Grandma out the window. Grandma is hanging on by a thread on the outside. Thomas realizes they are on the 29th floor. Grandma starts opening the glass. Thomas runs away and runs out of the hotel. Thomas hijacks a bike and speeds off. 30 minutes later Thomas arrives at Back Bay Station. Thomas gets onto an Amtrak Acela. 1 hour later Thomas gets off at the Amtrak station in Providence, Rhode Island. 3 seconds later Thomas sees a mysterious shadow flying. Thomas hears a strange sound. Thomas runs for his life when he hears his name being yelled. Thomas gets back onto the Acela. 2 seconds later the Acela departs. 20 minutes later Thomas gets off at Stamford, Connecticut. 20 seconds later Thomas sees Grandma flying and screaming. Thomas gets onto the Acela. 1.4 hours later the Acela arrives at Penn Station. Thomas gets off the train and sees Grandma awaiting his arrival. 1 second later Grandma screams at 350 decibels. Thomas runs for his life as Grandma takes out an electric whip. Grandma starts whipping Thomas. Thomas screams and runs even faster. Thomas escapes and Grandma begins punching herself. Grandma falls down and Thomas runs away. 1 second later Grandma gets up. Thomas gets onto a bus and escapes. Grandma gets into a tank and drives after the bus. A few minutes later Grandma blows up the Freedom Tower. A few seconds later Grandma and Thomas fly up with jetpacks. Thomas and Grandma take out katanas and begin fighting in the air. 10 seconds later they land and resume fighting on land. 30 minutes later the fight is still going on. Soon Grandma passes out from exhaustion. Thomas decides to get revenge. Thomas gets a bucket of paint and pours it on Grandma's nightgown. Grandma wakes up and screams. Grandma gets up and the police arrest Grandma. Grandma rips apart her handcuffs with her raw strength. A few seconds later Thomas surrenders. Grandma gives in and takes out a rifle. Grandma then eliminates Thomas. A few seconds later in heaven Thomas is being spoiled for his cruel life with Grandma. Conclusion. Hello all. I hope you enjoyed my most violent story ever. I really enjoyed making this. More stories to come. Bye for now.